Hey people, how's it going? Stephen Bauman here. In this video, I'm going to tell you all the stuff that I think is really cool about drawing the nose. We've all drawn portraits, we've all drawn a bunch of noses, but I promise you that there's about a dozen things you don't know about the nose that can help you draw it better. And this video, we're going to unpack those. All the clips and tips that you're going to see are part of a much longer tutorial that I made for my Patreon students for my Features in Focus series. If you want to learn more about this, of course, just follow the link in the description of this video. It'll take you right there and you can subscribe, get access to that lesson and like tons of other ones. But if you're on this channel, you probably knew that already. So let's just jump into the lesson.
The first thing I'm going to draw though is the major angles of the nose. So I'm going to look at the major angle of the top plane. I'm going to look at where that turns, and then I'm going to look at the major angle of the bottom plane of the nose. Now for that bottom plane, I'm just indicating the central section that is the septum. Later I'll get into the rest of that bottom plane, but for now I just want to make sure I measure these angles and make them as accurate as possible. But now that we've got this here, I want to get into the side plane. Before we get into that side plane though, I want to mention one thing about how I chose where to make this angle break. Usually we'll think about the bottom plane of the nose starting a little bit lower, but I would recommend that if you look for the highlight on the nose, you're going to find the height of where that major plane is actually breaking. Highlights tend to indicate a meeting of two planes, and so searching for the highlight is going to give you a better read on where that bottom plane begins, rather than just looking for a shadow edge or something like that. If you look closely, you're going to see a slightly higher key value along this turning edge, and that is the plane shift that I'm detecting. So we have a more narrow side plane at the top, a wider side plane at the bottom. Let's go ahead and also make some indications of where the nasal bone is actually articulating with the glabella, this broadening section of the frontal bone coming down to meet the nasal bone. Eventually in this drawing, maybe I'll make some slight indications of where the form of the septum actually flows out into what is called the philtrum, this little indentation above the upper lip and below the nose, and maybe a little bit of the form. Now, one thing that we do know is that the body is symmetrically built. So if we think about a center line running through the nose like this, we're going to find in the central area on either side of that center line one of the two structures that we call the major alar cartilage. Now it starts out on the top of the nose and curls underneath, eventually ending in this inner bottom corner of the nostril. I think where you see most evidence of it is going to be here, underneath the highlight, and also here at its upper edge, where it starts to turn over to the side plane of the nose. And I'm going to draw both sides of this. One of the sides, of course, explains really well, really clearly, what the shape of the kind of left-hand contour of the nose is. Now, the next structure I want to talk about is going to be on the right-hand side, on the lateral edge of the nose, and it's the wing of the nose. Now, anatomically, this is referred to as the alar fibrofatty tissue. It takes on a form somewhat like this. Eventually, it makes up the upper edge of the nostril and the lower lateral edge of the nostril as well. After that, if we travel up to this major angle break here, what we find is the meeting of the nasal bone, which we'll talk about later, and the upper lateral cartilage. If I had a recommendation for you, it would be to take some measurements, double check your angles, and allow these anatomical insights to be more of a background that helps you explain what it is you're seeing. Looking at the nose, we can find highlighted and high key values right along this 3/4 edge. In particular, we find a strong indication of highlight here on this turning plane of the major alar cartilage. So let's start actually by indicating the value on the bottom plane of the nose. I want to start to indicate this shadow shape on the left-hand side. Later on, I might go for a little bit of a difference in between the two to show the plane shift that happens between the bottom plane of the nose and the front plane of the face, where the cast shadow is. But for now, let's just bring those more or less together. While I'm at it, I'm also going to darken the inside of the nostril. The inside of the nostril and that value that we find there is what we call an ambient occlusion, meaning that even the ambient light that's getting into the bottom plane of the nose, and the direct light that's getting there for that matter, is occluded or blocked, creating an extra dark value inside that recess of the nostril. And why don't we accent a little bit some of the deeper planes inside the nose itself, you'll notice that as we get further down septum, we have a value change. It's kind of an intermediate plane shift right here. I want to get into the top and side plane. One of the things that you'll notice is that we have a high key value that runs through this central area. What that means really is that on both sides of this, from a value perspective, we have a halftone. So I'm going to hatch all the way across the form in a light halftone value. Then I'm going to take my finger and just kind of smudge that in a bit so we can start to pull out the higher key values that sit along this 3/4 edge. From this point, we need to start making the nose look overall round. So let's take a look at the top plane and that left-hand edge. See if we can add some value to help this form turn over, because I think that we have slightly darker values on this left side than we do on the right. But I also want to come back to this side plane here. As we lead up to that high key value along the 3/4 edge, notice that there's a little bit of a darker halftone kind of leading up to it. I want to indicate that now. Now to do all this, I'm using a 2H. I'd recommend that you use a relatively hard pencil like that, just because we're getting into more subtle halftones and you can hatch and make a lot of shapes with a 2H without it kind of showing up as being a really, really dark halftone. You can see that I'm hatching quite liberally, just getting to kind of a light halftone territory. Right through here, you can see that if we shade around the edges of this form, you get this little feeling of a separation, a bifurcation in between the two sides. As we get out to the edge of the nose, it's something I want to point out that affects how we see this side plane landing on the front plane of the cheek. The preface that I need to make before I draw this area, though, is that the entire face is covered in a series of fat deposits. Now, there's two that I want to talk about with respect to the nose. One is the nasolabial fat pad, which is found at the outer edge of the nose just beyond the wing, and together with the wing forms the furrow that is the nasolabial fold. We then have the radix fat that tends to soften out a little bit the transition in between the frontal bone and the upper edge of the nasal bone. Now, in between that fat pad, the wing of the nose, we tend to find a slightly highlighted value. What we can say for sure, though, is that the glabella and the fat pad that sits on top of it is a downward-facing plane, so it tends to be a little bit darker, helping the top of the nasal bone and the bridge of the nose to stand out as being an overall light value. Now on this inner upper corner, we have the darkness of the eye socket, the darkness of the eye, more or less sitting right behind it. So I'm going to exploit that for basically the dark edge that it leaves behind. It'll let me add a lot of halftone to this area. Then I'm going to adjust the value at the edge here so that we get a slightly more natural feeling with the turning of form at that edge. Okay, now that most of the informational section of this lesson is done, I'm going to speed ahead and finish the rendering of this drawing. I would suggest that you continue to refine your drawing, and once you've completed that, go on to draw the nose from several different perspectives. That way you'll have an opportunity to search out these specific features that we talked about here in different situations to flesh out completely your understanding of their character.
So that wraps up this scorching hot take on how to draw the nose just a little bit better. If you found this video fun, useful, interesting, or helpful, please just hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and consider signing up to my Patreon page to learn a lot more about how to draw better portraits.